Welcome to this story of the Sistine Chapel. In the coming videos, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about the Sistine Chapel. Now, if this is not already on your travel itinerary, I suggest you put the Sistine Chapel on the top of your bucket list immediately. It is by far the biggest work of art and probably the most influential work of art in all of history. But before you go, to get there, there are a few tips and tricks. Not to get to Rome, I assume you can make that. But these days, more and more museums have pre-booking, and you really should do that, because in the Vatican Museum notoriously has very long lines. They used to move really quickly, but now they don't because people book ahead. And when you book ahead, you get a time frame, so you can just walk in. And so that's much better than it was before. Also, when you get to the Vatican Museum, there's a slight problem with it being too big. It's a luxury problem, I know, and many museums have this. But the thing that people very often do, in my experience, is they try to see too much. And in many museums, I try to tell people, just go in, watch some stuff for an hour or so, go and have a drink somewhere else, do something else, and then go back. Because in many museums, you can just walk in and out with one ticket. The Vatican Museum is different. You can't do that. Because you have to follow this one route that they have. When you get in there, there's a bunch of museums you can choose from. There's several different collections of antique sculptures, of painting, of Etruscan treasures. And to be fair, all of those are very much worth watching. And all of those are too big to do in one day. So the trouble is, if you try to see everything, you're just going to get stuck. You will see too many things, and you won't be able to take it all in. So my advice would be, go twice. No, I know that sounds like a big deal, but it isn't. How many times are you going to go to Rome? Make the best of it. Do it the right way. So visit the Vatican Museum twice. Once just for the collection of ancient sculpture and maybe the paintings. And then you have to follow a route through the papal palaces. And it's a very long route. It used to be an enormous palace. And nowadays, the Pope, I guess, uses a much smaller bit of it. But you walk through endless halls, and you have to follow that route. And you come through some absolutely amazing places that you have to see as well. So do that on one visit, because in that visit, you're going to see the library that Raphael painted, and a number of apartments that you really would have, well, you won't have time for them. And then really, all the way at the end, you walk into the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel, the topic for today, and the Sistine Chapel itself deserves all of your attention, and that's why you should go twice. Once to see everything else, and then another time, and that other time by then you know the route, and you just get in there, start jogging, and after about 15 minutes, you'll be there and have the time to look around. Now, I'm going to share my screen so you can see my lovely little pictures that I've brought you. Now, the Sistine Chapel is a smallish chapel for Vatican sizes. It's right next to St. Peter's, and it was built sort of in the middle of other buildings. There used to be a smaller one before the 1470s, and that was too small. It had become too small. They needed a bigger one, especially for its main purpose, because it's a chapel used for several things. One is it's the personal chapel of the Pope, and for that he has two chapels, a big one and a small one, and this is the small one. No, sorry, this is the big one. So it used to be called Big Chapel of the two that he uses for his personal use. Now, the other thing they do there is the conclave. conclave is, of course, the election of the next pope. And for the conclave, they needed space, because in the old days they would get all the cardinals together and lock them up in the Sistine Chapel until a new pope would have been chosen, and that could take weeks. And the door would only be open for food and water and drink, I suppose. But they would live there, sleep there. They don't do that way anymore. Nowadays, there's a guest house on the Vatican grounds where all the cardinals have to stay, so that they're secluded from the rest of the world. But they still have their meetings in the Sistine Chapel. But in the 1470s, it had become apparent that the chapel they had wasn't big enough, and then the one they had was damaged by fire as well. So they had to. Well, some people say they restored it, others say they rebuilt it, because they built a significantly larger chapel. And it was done under Pope Sixtus IV, which admittedly is a strange name, because it means the sixth, but the fourth pope who's called the sixth. Anyway, Sixtus IV gave the order to build it, and that's why it's called the Sistine Chapel, called after the Pope, because that's what they do every time in the Vatican. Everything they call after the Pope who had it built. There are even simple restorations called after certain popes, and everything has a name of a pope, which is really good for historians like, well, me, because then with every name you already know just about when it was done. Anyway, Sistine Chapel, built in the late 1470s, was done right about 1480, and then they started doing the interior. Now, this is the exterior, and it's a drawing of the exterior, because it's very difficult to take pictures of it, because in reality it's hemmed in buildings. It's right next up to the St. Peter's, and on the other side there's the papal palaces themselves. So it's sort of built in, and that's the exact reason that it looks so boring. I mean, there's no attention paid to the outside, because there was no point. The way people used to get in was through the papal palaces, so you never saw the outside. There's no big entrance, wasn't necessary, and no decorations on the outside. And actually it was done up at in a sort of simple way. It's both chapel and conference hall. Now, I'm going to use a couple of names. This is Sixtus IV, the Pope that ordered the building. This portrait was made after he died by a painter called Titian. But when they built it, the Sistine Chapel looked something like this. This is a reconstruction made in the 19th century of what it would have looked like in roughly about 1485, because it was opened in 1483, and by that time all the walls and the ceiling had been painted. As you can see here, the ceiling had been painted with stars. There was a blue background with golden stars, which was pretty usual for a ceiling at the time. The walls had been painted by various quite famous artists of their time, of their generation. Nowadays it looks something like this, because of course the ceiling has been changed. But that has been done by another pope that I'm going to mention a lot as well. That is Julius II. He wasn't the direct successor of Sixtus IV. There were a few popes in between. He's of about a generation later, and he's actually literally a generation later, because he was a nephew of Sixtus IV. They were closely related, and as a young cardinal, because he was very young when he became a cardinal, this Julius II, he was the right-hand man of Sixtus IV. So he had a lot to do with the building of the Sistine Chapel, and turned out to be the guy who had the ceiling, who ordered the ceiling to be painted as well. Um, Here you see it from the other side. Um, and This is the last of the three popes that I'm going to mention a lot in this talk, and this is Paul III. Paul III was the pope halfway through the 16th century that had the last bit of the Sistine Chapel painted, and that's the Last Judgement by Michelangelo. But back to the beginning of the story. Here is the Sistine Chapel as it looked when it was opened in the 1483. A lot of paintings had been done on the walls. They're frescoes, by the way. And fresco, I'm going to use that term a lot as well, because that's the technique used in the Sistine Chapel and used for many, many walls in churches and other buildings. A fresco is a painting made on fresh plaster, a lime plaster. What you do is you have a wall with a rough plastering on it, and on that you make your drawing of your plan of what you're going to paint where, and just the bit you're going to do that day, you're going to plaster with fresh, new plaster, and that's going to be wet plaster. Then you use a paint which is only a pigment, only a color dissolved in water, so nothing else. And you use that on the wet plaster. What happens is the pigment is drawn into the plaster and becomes, as the plaster fixates, it becomes part of the wall, which means it's a very strong form of painting. And it can stay fresh looking for centuries. And all you have to do once in a while is clean it. So it's a very durable form of painting, and that's why they use it. You find it a lot in Italy, Greece, the Mediterranean in general. I live in the Netherlands. You don't find it here much at all because the climate doesn't allow it here. The plaster doesn't dry in the right speed, and so you find it mostly in Mediterranean areas, not farther north. And what they use is this technique to paint the walls, and there's a large number of scenes on those walls. Starting from one of the short sides of the chapel, you can see it in the end. There's a short side. It's a rectangular hall that is about 40 meters long and 13 meters across. The dimensions were copied from the Bible. It's sort of based on the Temple of Solomon in the Bible, but it is basically just a rectangular hall. It's nothing more fancy than that, and the only thing they did to decorate it is paint it. Now, Sixtus IV had the top painters of his generation come in and paint it. At first, Perugino from Perugia, he was one of the famous ones of his generation, and he was probably the lead artist. And then he invited a number of others to come in as well, and there were Ghirlandaio and Botticelli, Pinturicchio, a surprising number of Florentine painters. Surprising because usually you would expect only one major painter to do one of these projects with assistants, and you wouldn't expect them to have so many different masters for just one project, because that's just waiting for them to get into arguments. But nevertheless, this is the way they did it. Maybe it had something to do with diplomatic influences of Florence, but the fun thing is that Perugino, one of the lead painters, was the teacher of Raphael, and Ghirlandaio, who was there as well, was the teacher of Michelangelo. So two of the teachers of the great next generation worked side by side in the Sistine Chapel before. And what they did is they painted two narratives, two storylines, starting at the altar. They side by side on the short wall. On the one hand, you would have the birth of Jesus, and the other side the birth of Moses. And from there, along the longer walls, you would have on the one side the life of Jesus and on the other side the life of Moses, ending on the other shorter wall with, on the one hand, the resurrection of Jesus, and on the other hand, the fight over the body of Moses. So the sort of last scenes of their lives. There's a point to that. Those scenes are always they complement one another. So you have one scene on the one wall of the life of Jesus, and there's one on the other wall of the life of Moses, and they are usually, they reflect each other in composition and in meaning. For instance, here we have a picture of, I'm going to pull myself out of this for a bit. You can see a scene from the life of Moses. He comes back to Egypt, and he's stopped by an angel, and these are the events leading up to him circumcising his son. You can see here in the corner, where's my cursor? There you are. You can see there's a baby being circumcised in the right hand lower corner. The other image is of the life of Jesus is the baptism of Jesus. So basically, they're both the rituals of entering the religion, which on the one hand is circumcision with the Jewish religion, and with Christianity is baptism. By the way, you see lots of people standing around. They're usually portraits of people of the papal court, and usually in paintings like these, you had to pay to be added. So that was a way to finance these pictures, by adding so many portraits of people. Another one, almost at the end of it, is where Aaron, the brother of Moses, he was leading rituals, a mass, and his sons tried to take over, tried to do it as well, and they were punished for their insolence because they were too young to do it. They weren't ready to do it. That's the opposite of this one by Perugino, and one of the more famous ones of the walls, where Jesus gives the keys to heaven and hell to Saint Peter. Both of these paintings, both of these frescoes, are about the transition of rule in the religion. On the one hand, in the Jewish tradition, this would have gone with a fight, and in Christianity, it would be Jesus willingly giving the keys over to Saint Peter, and of course Saint Peter would be the predecessor of all the popes. That is really what this all wants to say. It wants to say the Pope is the boss of the world. He's the head of the Christian church, and Christianity is better than Judaism. It is the Sistine Chapel. It is the papal chapel, after all. You can see here Jesus giving this key to Saint Peter. He's kneeling in front of him, and often you can see there's not one but two keys. There's a golden key and a key made of lead, and the golden key is of course for heaven, and the key of lead is for hell. In the background, you can see two triumphal arches. They're the arches of Constantine. Constantine, of course, the emperor, once a Roman emperor, and the first emperor to be a Christian and to legalize Christianity, and was always seen as an important figure for Christianity. In Rome, of course, he was extra special, and he had this very large triumphal arch that they were restoring because they were starting to see how important he was to Christianity. And here in this sort of idealized city that they've made, where you can see a church in the middle and then not just one triumphal arch, but two of them. And both are copies of the one for Constantine. Now, that is the part of the wall that the walls that I'm going to show you. Skip over to the next video, and I'll start talking about the ceiling.